Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the Pan Future Podcast. Today is Saturday, November 18th, 2017. I do have an interview coming up today all about blockchain and Bitcoin, but I also want to let you know that I'm going to mess around with the show format again. A month and a half ago or so, I decided to try a little experiment with a long episode alternating with a episode that collects a bunch of news stories and short segments. That wasn't really working for me. I wasn't really feeling it. So we're going back to the more usual couple of news hits and then a longer segment on the show. Anyway, for this week, the news this week, I was just going to run the interview, but I decided that you've probably heard this story. If you haven't, it's really remarkable and it needs to be covered. A boy has been given gene-corrected skin. Doctors took some of his stem cells, corrected the genetic abnormality in these cells, and grew skin grafts for him. This boy, his name is Hassan. They're not giving his last name, of course. Just after he was born in Syria, he developed severe blisters. He was diagnosed with a genetic disorder called epidermolysis bullosa, which leaves your skin extremely fragile and prone to tearing. It can give you blisters and just open wounds, and there is no cure. His family fled the war in Syria to Germany, and doctors there gave him the same diagnosis. In 2015, he was taken to the burn unit of a children's hospital with about 60% of his skin, epidermis, gone. Continuous open wounds, and things were really bad, and they were looking to just start end-of-life care. But his father asked about experimental treatments, and they contacted Michel De Luca, a stem cell biologist at the University of Modena, and Reggio Emilia. Over the past few decades, they have been working on a way to give EB patients new skin by taking the stem cells, editing the genes, and using those to create new grafts. He and his colleague Graziella Pellegrini had tried this in 2006 on a smaller scale. They treated a 49-year-old woman with a wound on her right leg. Now, in doing this, they were successful. They took some stem cells, they edited the flaws in the genes, and they grew a new skin for him. They replaced 80% of his old skin. That just blows my mind. 80% of his skin was grown with this technique, which does not have the defect in the gene. And back in February of 2016, he was discharged from the hospital. In March, he went back to school. He needs no ointments. His skin is strong. They say it doesn't even itch. He hasn't developed a single blister, says De Luca. You share the details of Hassan's story here. He's gaining weight. He's playing sports. He's got a normal social life. So this is quite remarkable. Just the science aspect of it itself, and the fact that they could do this for a disease that's basically has no cure. And even though if you've never heard of it, it affects about 1 in every 20,000 people in the United States. So that is quite remarkable, and I wanted to share that this week. And that's the news for now. And let's get on with our interview. Excellent introduction to blockchain and Bitcoin with Steve McKeon. All right, thanks everybody for joining me. This week I have Steve McKeon, Associate Professor of Finance at the University of Oregon. Welcome to the show, Steve.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me.
All right. Just a disclaimer up front, Steve is here on his own with expressing his own opinions, not necessarily those of University of Oregon, et cetera, and so on. All right. So I have asked you to come in today to help us understand Bitcoin. And first, how about some just basic definitions of what Bitcoin is?
Sure. So there's a lot of different names for it. You often hear the term cryptocurrency. Mm-hmm. A lot of people know Bitcoin as a cryptocurrency. Maybe even a wider definition would be something like crypto asset. You also hear digital asset or digital currency. So there's a lot of different names floating around, but cryptocurrency is one that most people would recognize.
Is Bitcoin kind of a brand name? It's a particular kind of crypto.
It was the very first one. Uh-huh. So there's an underlying technology called blockchain, and we can get into what that is. But Bitcoin was basically the first example of blockchain technology. So it is. Mm-hmm. You could think of it like a brand. It's a very specific token that lives on a blockchain, and these days there are many more. But Bitcoin was the first.
All right, I'm already slightly confused. So let's go ahead and define blockchain, because it seems like I thought the cryptocurrency came first or sort of hand in hand, but it sounds like blockchain is the foundation really of
That's
how
right.
the whole thing works.
So you could think of all of this, all of these cryptocurrencies, and then there's many other applications that we can talk about, but really the underlying technology to all of them is blockchain. And the way you could think about blockchain is you often hear the term distributed ledger. So a lot of times the way I explain this to people is I'll start from something they're familiar with. Mm-hmm. So if you think about making a payment using the regular banking system, like if I was to write you a check, right? So I write you a check, and you take the check, you put it in the ATM into your account, and then what happens? Well, what happens is your bank then sends it up through the central banking system over to my bank, and my bank really checks two things. They check something called authentication. So that's like the signature on a check. That's like proving that I am the one that actually sent that payment to you.
Okay.
And then the other thing they prove is something called authorization, mm-hmm. which is that I have enough money in my account, like that I actually own the thing I'm trying to transfer to you, like $10 or whatever. Right. Once my bank has verified those two things, authentication, authorization, they say, all right, this payment is good. They send the $10 back up through the central banking system, and eventually it ends up in your account. And so your bank changes their ledger and says, now you have $10 more, and my bank changes their ledger and says, now I have $10 less.
And people should keep in mind, too, that we don't think about it much, but all of this is happening. This is just shuffling ones and zeros around, and nothing has actually physically changed hands.
That's right. So blockchain is very similar to that situation in the sense that it takes the place of the intermediary of that central banking system. So imagine now that it wasn't like you had a bank with a ledger and I had a bank with a ledger. Let's imagine that the whole world operated on the same ledger. So everybody's account was sort of at the same place. That's the kind of the starting point for understanding blockchain. And so then when I send you a payment, say 10 Bitcoin instead of $10, basically what the computer does is the two things I described before. So using cryptography, I can prove that it actually was me that sent the payment. And because everyone has an account on the same ledger, they can look in there and see that I actually have the Bitcoin that I'm trying to transfer. And so all they do is change basically my ledger balance is now 10 Bitcoin less, and your ledger balance is 10 Bitcoin more. But fundamentally, that's what blockchain does, is authentication and authorization, but it's just a network of computers. It doesn't actually go through a physical intermediary.
Okay, so it's like a distributed system
of ownership.
Of ownership. Okay.
Yep. It's a distributed record. It's a distributed sort of ledger of ownership records.
And that's, I hear about the security of this kind of a system. Is that what makes it secure? Because there are multiple, you're not just relying on one computer server somewhere that has that information.
That's right. So if you say there were 1,000 nodes, we call them miners, and we can talk about what a miner does, but say there's like 1,000 copies of this ledger. So now if you submit a ledger and say you put a fraudulent transaction in, like, oh, Steve actually sent me 10 Bitcoin 10 days ago, everyone else would know that that's false because everyone else has a copy of the same ledger, and they would say, no, that ledger doesn't match. That ledger is fraudulent. So the thing that really keeps it secure is this cryptography. So the idea that you could like I have a private key, that's what proves it's me when I send you a payment.
Okay.
The idea that you could guess what that is, I guess I asked somebody how easy this would be to spoof. Like, how easy would it be for somebody to guess my private key? And they said something like, if you had 1 billion people trying 1 billion combinations per minute, like it's more likely the sun would explode before you. So it's very, very difficult.
Okay. Okay. So while we're still on blockchain, then, is blockchain, is it just a piece of code, or is it embedded in the files?
Yeah, so the blockchain is basically, we call it a protocol, that basically all of these nodes, which we call miners. So miners are the ones that collect up the transactions and verify them. So like, say I send you a Bitcoin. Somebody has to go in and check that that's a valid, that I actually own those Bitcoin, that it was in fact me that sent you the payment. And they do something called proof of work, which is very complicated and technical. We probably don't need to go there. But basically, you could think of the miners as the ones that are collecting up all these transactions and verifying them. And they're running on the same Bitcoin protocol, which does get updated by the Bitcoin developers.
Okay. So this blockchain method could be applied to other things. Like, could we prove that photographs are false or true by incorporating that into
That's
there?
right. So there's, people have talked about a lot of different use cases for this. So there's all the financial use cases, like we could prove it to, or we could use it to prove ownership of my house, like a piece of real estate could go on a blockchain, right? We could use it to prove ownership of a stock or a bond or any sort of financial asset you could think about an application. But it actually extends well beyond financial applications. So say that you want to prove your identity, right? So there are groups working on identity blockchains, protocols that allow you to kind of like own your identity and then release it to people selectively. Like if you want to get a bank loan, or if you want to prove that you have a driver's license, or for whatever purpose you can dream up. The idea is that you would control it, not somebody else. Because right now, people don't really own their own digital identities. Like you probably have a Google account, right? And that's a digital identity. Or you have you have an identity at Apple, like in the iTunes store. But the truth is, you don't really control those; they do. And so this is sort of a different version of that.
And then through the system of nodes, all that becomes probably exponentially more secure than just having one password with Google. Or
That's right. So you often hear the term immutable. And what that basically means is that once something is written to the chain, it's virtually impossible to change it. And so that's why that's sort of a big concept within blockchain is trust. The idea that right now, when you and I, like the check idea, right? So the idea is, say you and I don't know each other, so we don't trust each other. So we need an intermediary like the central bank to like take the money out of your account and put it in mine or whatever. And what blockchain does is it creates trust between two parties that don't know each other because of these immutable records.
Okay. All right. Great. Now, most widespread use now is with this cryptocurrency. What are people using this for right now?
So I would say that the primary use case right now for something like Bitcoin is usually referred to as store of value. So the closest analogy is something like gold, right? Gold, in a sense, has no intrinsic value. It's basically a rock. There's lots of other rocks. We don't think that, a piece of graphite or whatever is worth, thousands of dollars per ounce. But somehow we have a collective belief that gold is worth, some very high price per ounce. It's a similar analogy to Bitcoin, right? So the idea is like, if everyone sort of buys in, so I think the first thing is that it's scarce, right? There will only be 21 million Bitcoin ever. That's the maximum number that could ever be mined, I guess you could say. And so in that sense, it's similar to gold. And this, the idea is that there's only so much gold, and there's some, maybe down below the ground that we can mine out, but there is a fixed amount of gold total. Right. And so that creates a scarcity, which leads to this idea that it's worth a certain amount per unit. And it's the same thing with Bitcoin. So the idea is like, if you want to store some value, what are the ways you could do it? You could put it in stocks, you could put it in bonds, you could put it in real estate, or you could put it in some sort of asset like gold, right? And what's happening is, especially the younger generation, is putting it into things like Bitcoin instead of gold.
So you mentioned that sometimes this is referred to as a crypto asset, and that sounds like a more apt description than, like, Bitcoin is not necessarily a substitute for cash in your pocket. Certain stores do accept it or whatever, but that might not be its ultimate best use.
That's right. So this is a topic of much debate, I would say, within the space. Some people really believe that it has to become a widely used payment rail for it to be successful, and many others of us, including myself, don't believe it actually has to fulfill the payment mechanism in terms of like day-to-day commerce, right? So it's very, very secure. So it leads to this question of like, do you need that level of security to buy a cup of coffee, right?
Yeah,
Maybe
right.
not. And so I think, the way this is going to evolve is that there's going to be other blockchain tokens, other cryptocurrencies, if you will, that are sort of better suited technologically to process a very high volume of transactions, maybe at a slightly lower level of security, one that we still generally trust, but one that is sort of optimized for speed and high volume of transactions.
And maybe somewhere much farther down the road if we ever completely abandon paper money or something like that and have a fully electronic system.
Yeah, so there's a group of people that believe that eventually the Fed will issue something. So they, I've seen papers that kind of refer to this as Fed coin, right? So what if they, just issued dollars just like they do now, but instead of issuing them in paper and, the electronic versions they use with banks, what if they put all of that on a blockchain? And that's sort of an interesting thing to think about. It's certainly the Fed will not be the first central bank to do so.
So are there central banks out there looking at this right
now? Estonia looked at it and was seriously considering, I don't know about seriously, but at least they were considering the idea of establishing a national currency on chain. They ran into some problems with the EU because the EU doesn't allow their member countries to issue their own currencies. So the EU almost would have to agree to put euros on chain. But I suspect there are going to be countries that enact this probably in less than 5 years.
Okay. I guess that kind of raises another question that I have too is it legal and how so? And I'm sure that question has been kicked around quite a bit.
Yeah, so the regulatory side of this I find really fascinating because certainly some of what's going on is not legal. But much of what's going on is perfectly legal. So me owning Bitcoin, perfectly legal. Me sending Bitcoin to you, paying you with Bitcoin, or paying for a cup of coffee with Bitcoin, there's nothing illegal about any of that.
So this is not a case of somebody didn't just sit down at a computer and decide to invent their own form of currency and assign it a value and say, I have 10 of these and they're worth $12,000 a piece.
Well, it's interesting. So, it was in a sense invented by someone. So the person who wrote the original white paper is named Satoshi Nakamoto. That was a pseudonym. No one actually knows who that person is. Partly, perhaps, because they feared some sort of legal retribution down the road. And so initially it had no value. It was just sort of an idea that was invented. And the very first transaction for a physical good was for 2 pizzas. and I don't remember the exact date, but I do remember that it was in May, something called Bitcoin Pizza Day. And basically they posted up on a message board effectively that said, I will pay 10,000 Bitcoin to anyone that can deliver 2 pizzas to my house. And so what happened? Somebody called, I don't remember if it was Domino's or Papa John's or whatever.
Yeah.
And they said, deliver 2 pizzas to this address. They paid them. And so 2 pizzas showed up. And then the guy transferred 10,000 Bitcoin to the person who had fulfilled that order. 10,000 Bitcoin today is worth millions of dollars. So
Yeah,
it's
I
actually
was
the
gonna
probably
say.
most expensive food purchase in the history of mankind.
So how did Bitcoin get a dollar value?
So it's really just a progression of that story I just told, right? So if, say, 2 pizzas was $10, right, and somebody spent, 10,000 Bitcoins, then we would say the value of Bitcoin is, 1/1000th of a dollar, something like that. And then in time, people started buying more stuff, right? And then whatever somebody was willing to give them in exchange for Bitcoin basically established the price. Pretty soon you had the rise of exchanges. So people started buying and selling Bitcoins just for dollars, not for necessarily physical goods.
Okay.
And then there were exchanges like, so right now you could go, so Coinbase is one that people often talk about, where you could open an account at Coinbase, you could go on there, they'll have a market price, say it's $5,500, $5,600 right now, and I could buy a Bitcoin or a fractional piece of a Bitcoin at that price because there's somebody else out in the world that's willing to sell Bitcoin at that price. So it's a traditional sort of market structure at this point.
One of the first places I ever saw Bitcoin in use was with a music site. And I'm a musician, so I was looking for places to sell my music. And some sites said, upload your MP3s here and people can pay Bitcoin for your songs. And nothing actually ever came of that for me. But that was pretty early on. And looking back at it, I think people who were early adopters of this, I guess as it often is with early adoption, are kind of taking a big risk when they start transacting real world money or goods for Bitcoin, which, like anything digital, could have just dried up and blown away in the wind too.
That's right. So you see, so I think you come back to this question about why would somebody want to pay in Bitcoin or receive Bitcoin as payment. The thing that people often point to is transaction fees. So the transaction fees are, if you do a regular credit card payment, maybe you're paying 2 or 3% transaction fee if you're the merchant. If you accept Bitcoin, you actually pay no transaction fees. The sender pays a very small fee. But it's, I guess there's a lot less friction in terms of the way payments are made. And it's also more secure. So Overstock.com is one of the first big retailers to accept Bitcoin on a wide basis. And they said not only are we avoiding the merchant services fees, but there's virtually no fraud. There's effectively no fraud, right? Whereas they say some percentage of our credit card sales are subject to fraud. That costs a bunch of time and money, whereas you don't face that at all with Bitcoin or with a cryptocurrency. So those are the things that are going to drive adoption of this as a payment mechanism in the long run.
Okay. How is the competition between different cryptocurrencies playing out? I can't imagine someone, the state of Oregon introducing its own version of the dollar somehow.
That's right. So government entities, you have not seen a lot of government entities issue their own sort of token, we would say, yet.
Yeah.
However, you see there's probably 15 or 1,600 different blockchain tokens at this point. Some of those are currencies, kind of like what you would think of as Bitcoin. But many others are sort of a token for a particular type of digital good, whether that's file storage or, something, identity verification, or, there's all these different use cases. So there's a lot of other cryptocurrencies besides Bitcoin. You could think of something like the second largest blockchain token is called Ethereum. And Ethereum basically is, it's often described as a worldwide computer. So if you have Ethereum, you can basically purchase computing power on this worldwide computer, but effectively people are using it in much the same way that they're using Bitcoin, store of value, use as a payment mechanism, things like this.
Okay. I guess with the disclaimer that you're not here to give specific financial advice, is Bitcoin a good idea for just anyone to get into? Is it a good investment? Should I, as a lower middle class homeowner in Oregon, have Bitcoins?
Sure. So let me let me describe that without giving financial advice, as you mentioned. So the way I would describe it is this. There are certainly paths for Bitcoin to appreciate in value substantially over where it is now. I think it's at about 5,600 today. There are paths where it could go up a lot, right? So say that it really genuinely becomes sort of a substitute asset for gold. Right now, the total value of all Bitcoins is between 100 and 200 billion dollars. Sounds like a lot, but the total value of all gold is 7 or 8 trillion dollars, right? So if it, say, replaced 5 or 10% of gold, it would go up a lot in value. However, on the flip side, I would say there's also a lot of risks to Bitcoin, right? So there's a lot of paths where it could end up becoming worth less than what it's worth now.
Yeah.
So it's right now it's forking a lot, and that's kind of a complicated subject, but it's sort of where the currency splits into two different chains. And some people think that's going to happen maybe 4 times. It happened recently between Bitcoin and something spun off called Bitcoin Cash, and it's going to happen maybe 4 more times in the next, say, 30 days. And it could happen, 100 more times, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
there is some concern about what happens as it becomes more and more fractured. Now, as they split, you get a token on both chains. So and in the case of Bitcoin Cash, both of them actually went up in value subsequently. So that ended up being beneficial, but
So it's sort of like a stock split.
Yes, it is. Actually, it's very close to something called spin-off. So say you have a company and they take one division and they say this division is now going to be its own company. And so you still have your stock in the original company, and now you have a new share of stock in the spin-off. It's very similar to something like that. So the short answer is we don't know what's going to happen, right? I'm very, very bullish on the whole space. In terms of, I do believe cryptocurrency is going to become prolific. I do think you're going to see central banks that start to get involved in it. But it's very hard to make predictions about any individual token because there's so many different sort of routes it could go, and there's so much uncertainty about how things are going to unfold.
Yeah. It sounds like it's a very useful tool, but it's not necessarily a thing like gold or stocks or bonds necessarily.
I think it is. I do think it bears some similarity to gold. The benefit it has over gold is that there's no cost to store it, and it's much easier to trade. Right. So gold, you have investment assets, but to physically hold gold and then to sell it, there's a lot of sort of that's not an easy thing to do, right? Yeah. And so it does have some advantage. I would say of all those things you just named, it is closer to gold than it is to, say, a stock or a bond or something like that.
You mentioned earlier the younger generation is quite comfortable with this idea. Describe that more, because, I'm almost 42, and so I'm not comfortable with this idea.
That's right. I'm 40, and I feel very old when I go to these conferences. So I was at something called Token Summit in last May, which was sort of like the first big conference that focused on tokens generally, so not just Bitcoin, not just Ethereum, but sort of the whole token ecosystem. And I was well above the median age in the room, and I would say the median age was somewhere probably mid-20s, something like that. I think there's a lot of reasons why that's the case. In terms of early adoption, you saw a lot of... So first of all, I think the younger you get, the more technologically savvy people are sort of at the median, right? So like when I grew up, I didn't have internet in high school, for example.
Right,
It wasn't until after high school that I got online for the first time. Like now people get online as soon as they can read, right? Or, maybe before then. And so people have grown up around sort of native digital applications to a much larger degree than people certainly in their 40s and up, and really even people in their 30s. So I'd say they're more comfortable with the idea that you could create an asset that is strictly natively digital and that thing would have value. In a way that people my age and certainly people older than me just aren't comfortable with, right? It feels like it has to be tangible because we grew up in a very tangible world. We didn't grow up in a natively digital world.
Yeah, even if it's something like, shuffling money around on credit cards, I still know that that's backed by a bank that has certain laws that apply to it and all that sort of thing. The cryptocurrency seems to be, it's a bit of a Wild West now.
It is definitely a Wild West. There's this saying that, code is law, right? So the idea that, the one thing with banks is that they can go under. Now the government can bail them out and there's FDI insurance and things like that. But I think in the quote-unquote real world or the financial system we have now, things can change. I think that's one thing, right? So you have a loan and then the bank decides, say you have a line of credit, right? And the bank decides like they want to cancel your line of credit. That's something they can do. Yeah. So maybe you thought you had a bunch of credit that you'd be able to, tap into when you needed it. Right. But sometimes right when you need it is precisely when it gets rescinded. I think the idea that, to the extent that something is encoded and can't be changed, that's something that especially young people will sort of identify with.
Do you find, too, that there are certain people that they're enthusiastic about it because it's decentralized, because it's not tied to a bank or to a certain government
Absolutely.
institution?
I mean, there's a lot of distrust in society today, and I would say that the distrust is particularly acute in younger generations, right? So people that sort of went through the financial crisis right as they were kind of beginning their lives as adults, and saw the havoc that reaped, and in terms of unemployment and in terms of our general financial system and everything like that, it introduced a lot of skepticism. And of course, everyone who was alive went through that. But I think it affected people who went through it right at the beginning of their adult life when they were, say, late teens up through mid-20s. It affected them a little bit differently, perhaps, than the rest of us that had sort of like progressed down our paths a little further.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. Have there been known, how would you phrase it, attacks on the system? Are hackers? I mean, I'm sure someone is trying to break this system, but
so these things are under attack all the time. The way that the ways in which these assets are stolen is usually so think about it this way. I can't guess what your private key is, right? So I can't hack it in that way. But if I can acquire your private key, then I can transfer the Bitcoin to me, right? And because it's all pseudonymous, you won't know who I am and so on and so forth. So the way these things usually get hacked is by somebody who's getting access to private keys. So say I put my money on an exchange. So Bitfinex was a big exchange hack, or Mt. Gox a few years ago was an exchange that got hacked. And if you think, so take Bitfinex, in order to trade my Bitcoin, I have to say, give my private key to Bitfinex, and they're going to hold on to it while my assets are up with them. Okay. And so when you pool all these things together, there's this old saying from Willie Sutton. Somebody asked, Willie Sutton was like a bank robber back, 100 years ago or something. And they said, Willie, why do you rob banks? And he said, that's where the money is.
Right.
Right? And it's the same idea with exchanges. Like, say I own 2 Bitcoin, right? No hacker is going to put the effort in probably to go try and hack into my systems and steal my 2 Bitcoin. But if it's pooled with thousands and thousands and thousands of other Bitcoins up at the exchange, now that creates a huge honeypot, right? And so most of the attacks, I would say, have been at the exchange level, or maybe individuals that have large holdings. So there was another form of hack was people had something called 2-factor authorization or authentication, where, like, say I wanted to make a trade on my account, they would send me a text to verify, right? Sure. So hackers realized that if they could get access to the phone number, they could get access to the account. And so they would call Sprint and say, hey, I'm Steve McKeon, and I want to transfer my number over to Verizon or whatever the other service is, right? So they would effectively get control of the phone number, go in, say, I lost my password, text me a reset, change your password, and steal your assets that way. So the way that hacks happen is by people somehow getting access to your private keys, not by guessing your private key, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And the private key, is that just something how do you get one, I guess?
So you get one when so if I was to go buy some Bitcoin, right, and I would store that Bitcoin in a wallet, and there would be a private key associated with that Bitcoin. So if you own any crypto assets, and really when we talk about owning say I own 1 Bitcoin, what that really means is I have the right to transfer that Bitcoin, right? There's nothing physical about it. I don't own it and put it in my pocket. But this private key is my way of saying I can spend this Bitcoin however I choose. By basically using this private key, I can send a message that transfers this Bitcoin to somebody else or some fraction of it. So it's just so you could think of it, I guess, maybe like a password would be a reasonable analogy. Sure. But it's something that whoever has it has the right to transfer that crypto asset.
Okay. If someone, we'll get into a little bit about how, if one wanted Bitcoins, how you would get them, like that the kiosk at the mall. If you're just paying cash for Bitcoins, how does that transaction happen?
Sure. So we call these on-ramps, right? So at some point, once you own Bitcoin, you can kind of operate in this whole parallel financial system.
Yeah.
And but at some point, you either have to earn the Bitcoin by mining, but I would say more commonly these days, somebody's paying money for the Bitcoin. And then eventually, if you ever wanted to kind of extract it from that system, you would have to be able to get it back into fiat currency, so something like US dollars. Yeah. So I'll kind of cover a couple main on-ramps. So that these are sort of the bottlenecks, I guess, between the fiat currency world and the Bitcoin world. Yeah. So one is you could open an account at Coinbase or any other exchange that accepts fiat, and I open an account. It's just like if I had an account at Merrill Lynch or Fidelity or anything like this, right? Like you log on, you send in a wire, or like you connect your bank account just like you would with PayPal, I guess.
Sure.
And you say, buy 1 Bitcoin, and they take $5,600 out of your account. Or maybe you say buy 1.1 Bitcoin. They take $560 out of your account. That's one way to sort of purchase Bitcoin with fiat currency. I guess the other way maybe is through something like an ATM, like the one you saw at Gateway Mall. And there are people working on projects to actually create a huge network of these ATMs. So I will admit I've never actually used one of these ATMs. But presumably, like you go on there and you could deposit money and get Bitcoin deposited to a wallet that you control. So basically similar in some ways to the Coinbase example. But Yeah, the main way, I mean, the other thing is, like, if you found somebody with Bitcoin, like, I have a little Bitcoin, maybe you come to me and you just say, hey, would you sell me 1/10 of a Bitcoin? And you could create a wallet. There's lots of different kinds of wallets. And, you give me $500 or whatever, and I send you 1/10 of a Bitcoin. So that's like we call that over-the-counter transaction. Like you can find just people that have Bitcoin and buy some from them if they're willing to sell it to you.
Okay. So getting that money back out then, like at Coinbase, you could say, sell my Bitcoin, send me the cash.
That's exactly right. So you can do it in both directions, right?
Okay.
So you could buy some and they take it out of your bank account, or say I have some and I want to sell a little bit. I sell it and now I have US dollars, and I could say put it back in my bank account.
Yeah. Okay. Not that long ago, Bitcoin did make quite a bit of news because it, if I remember right, the value of it ballooned quite a great deal.
That's right.
What was that situation? And is the Bitcoin market every bit as volatile and prone to fluctuations as any other market?
Yeah, I would say it's actually even more volatile right now than most other markets that you would look at. We're still in the middle of that appreciation that you mentioned. So there have been several points in history where because remember, like, go back to that pizza example.
Yeah.
Like, there was a point where Bitcoin was worth, 1/10 of a cent, something like that.
Yeah.
So when it went from that to 1 cent, that was a massive appreciation, right? When it went from 1 cent to $1, that was 100x appreciation. And went from $1 to $100, that was 100x appreciation. So we've had all kinds of sort of huge appreciation if you go back to the beginning. Now, recently, I think the appreciation you're talking about, which is kind of the one that's happened in 2017, is where it went from under $1,000 up to, like, today, it's about $5,600. So that's a 5x increase. And in terms of dollars, it's huge, right? It's gone from, say, 1,000 to 5,000. That's in number of dollars. That's a huge increase.
Yeah.
It's not nearly as big an increase in percentage terms as when it went from 10 cents to $1.
Right.
Right? So I guess if you take a historical perspective, the appreciation has been a lot, but we've also seen it. It's been going like this since the beginning, with obviously large downturns as well all along the way.
And is this driven by people using Bitcoin to pay for things, or people just wanting to have them to hold on to them as an investment? Or
I think there's some of both. We pay attention to something called on-chain transaction volume. So that's it's some of everything, but at least part of that is people actually making payments for goods and services. In the U.S., that seems odd to us. We have credit cards, like we have ways to pay for things electronically already, PayPal, whatever. In other countries, it's not so odd, right? So in other countries where you have capital controls or you have very volatile currencies, places in Latin America, places in Africa, places in Asia, the idea of actually using Bitcoin on a daily basis is not it doesn't seem as abnormal as it might be to, say, Americans or people in Western Europe, where we have very stable financial systems. And so I think you're seeing adoption pick up much more quickly in some of these foreign countries than you are in the U.S., at least in terms of using it for trade. But the other piece you said is that people are beginning to trust it more as an actual store of value. And so you're seeing more demand on the investment side as well.
Okay. Yeah, it's interesting. I hadn't really thought about that or heard about that, the use in certain other countries like in Latin America or Africa. It sounds like it would parallel the adoption of mobile phones. There's a lot of countries where even electricity is not necessarily reliable, and the people have kind of skipped the home computer part, and just the mobile phone has become such a central part of their lives and their financial lives. I could easily see them skipping credit cards and checks, going straight to a digital currency.
That's right. I mean, in fact, digital currencies, maybe not blockchain based, but maybe something more like PayPal,
Yeah.
have already been widely used in Africa. And as you said, because the banking system wasn't as developed, or like I was in China a few weeks ago, and everybody was using WeChat and Alipay for transactions, like at the supermarket or at the, kind of like the convenience store, and you'd see people go through the line and they just hold their phone up.
Yeah.
And that was the way they were making payments, even not just between each other, but for at actual retail establishments. Now, those aren't blockchain based, but the idea, I think, is that blockchain solutions are potentially going to make those more efficient and less costly in the longer run.
Yeah, and it sounds like, at least among certain age groups and in certain places, that sort of transaction, people are just very comfortable with it.
That's absolutely right. It's definitely a cultural thing, and there's definitely an age effect. But I think there are places where you're seeing, in particularly in Africa, mobile payments. Changing money mobily, transacting mobily, very common. It's very common in Asia. I would say it's probably less common here than in most parts of the developing world. And not just developing, but really just many places outside the U.S. You don't see as many people using, say, Apple Pay, we have similar solutions, but they're just not as widely adopted for various reasons.
You mentioned mining as a way to acquire Bitcoin. Describe that.
Sure. So, basically, the way I describe it to people is a starting point is to think of miners as like accountants. So the idea is like, when I want to send you a Bitcoin, what I do is I basically send out a message to the network, and it says, take my Bitcoin, here's my wallet, here's your wallet, transfer 1 Bitcoin from this wallet to that wallet. And somebody has to go through and check these things, right, to make sure that they're valid. So that's kind of what miners are doing, is they're collecting these things up, they're validating them, and again, they're trying to solve this very complicated mathematical puzzle. The reason they're doing that is because that's what actually makes the system secure. Because when they finish, there's something called proof of work, and it proves like, I went through all the effort to sort of like figure out this block and to
Is
validate
there
all
actually
these
a
things.
person sitting doing a process?
Not at all.
No,
Definitely all automated. In fact, these days the power required is so substantial that back in the day you could just do it on your own computer, right? Like you could hook up your computer and usually like with a graphics card or something like that, and start mining Bitcoins. And these days, the equipment that mines Bitcoin is very specialized. It's much more powerful.
Yeah.
And it's predominantly done in China. Like you'll see warehouses just with this specialized equipment that are running Bitcoin mining operations.
Okay. And in the process of mining, not only, you're validating transactions, but are you also acquiring Bitcoin?
Yeah, so when you could think of it like this, like all these miners are trying to kind of solve a puzzle, right? And you could think of the transactions as like the puzzle pieces. And so about every 10 minutes, almost randomly, somebody solves the puzzle, right? And when they solve the puzzle, they say, here's the block, here's the proof of work. They get a reward. So in the block, they the first transaction is they give themselves a reward. And maybe so right now I believe it's 12.5 Bitcoin. So it halves every so often, right? So it used to be 25 Bitcoin was the reward for a block. Now it's 12.5, and then eventually it'll be 6.25. And so this is why there's only 21 million eventually, is because that keeps halving all the way down to virtually nothing. So that's how they get paid, is through, you can also attach transaction fees. Like when I send a payment, I can put some transaction fees so it'll get confirmed quicker.
Yeah.
But I guess that's the short version of how
Okay.
mining works. Is they put a reward when they're validating all these transactions.
Yeah.
They put an extra transaction in the block, which provides their
Okay.
reward.
Okay. I don't have any other specific questions. Is there anything else you want to add just for the general public that they should know about?
Yeah, so I would say,
Cryptocurrency?
I guess my general message is that if you think about the way blockchain is going to develop, we spent a lot of time talking about Bitcoin. And that's really, it is the place to start because it was the first blockchain asset and it's sort of the purest, example of it.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of a good sort of venue to kind of explain this stuff. But blockchain is going to ultimately be much more than Bitcoin. So Bitcoin is just one example. It's going to have lots of additional use cases beyond currencies, and it basically creates sort of private economies around some of these digital goods. So a lot of this stuff can get very complicated, but the future is going to be a very interesting place as this develops. And so I guess I would encourage people, regardless of what you think about Bitcoin, pay attention to the entire ecosystem because there's going to be a lot of development in this area as we move forward.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Well, thanks for joining me today, Steve. I appreciate it.
All right. Thanks for having me.
All right, and there is your show for the week. Thank you so much, Steve, for dropping by to talk to me. And thank you, listeners, for tuning in. Now, this interview I did a month ago, actually. And even in the short time since the interview was conducted, there has been an enormous amount of blockchain and Bitcoin news flying about lately. So if you've been paying attention, you've seen it. And I'm going to put a bunch of links in the show notes. Please do check those out. I've got a link to an article that Steve wrote and he sent me. Has a lot of great information in it. Plus some other things. Probably the big news lately is the fork for Bitcoin Gold, which I think Steve mentioned in the show there that it was expected to fork fairly soon, and it did. And according to some people, it didn't go well. Also got some news articles about what big banks think of Bitcoin, and the Russian government apparently going all in with this. So, do please check out the show notes at panfuture.org and see those links, or just, pop over to Google News and type in Bitcoin and blockchain, and you will see tons of stories popping up every day about this stuff. Whether or not you're all in on it right now or not, it is growing. It is going to, I think, stick around, and especially the blockchain part of this is going to see a much wider use in the near future. Like I said, go to panfuture.org for the show notes, and you can find the Twitter and the Facebook and the YouTube links and all that, and the Patreon page if you want to chip in to help out the show. Other than that, that's all I got for you this week. Thanks again, and I will talk to you in the future.
These are the last words you'll hear. The last time you will look in my eyes, staring at this terminal. We chose our path without fear, knowing there was no room for any lies. Understanding this is terminal. Goodbye, goodbye.
I have my obligations. To those central to me all my life. Even though this line is terminal. At least we have one more moment. Watching Earth come to